Welcome to Hope Stories, where one roadside encounter can change everything. Imagine a man who once ruled the boardroom now lying in the dust, broken and invisible, and a widow with two little girls who has every reason to keep driving, but instead stops. What happens when two shattered worlds collide under a setting sun? This is not just a story about failure or second chances. It's about the kind of love and redemption that forces us to ask, how far can someone fall and still find their way home? Stay with us, because what unfolds next will challenge what you believe about forgiveness and the power of one brave choice. Now let's step into their world and see how it all began. The sun was sinking behind the endless stretch of cornfields when Hannah pulled her dented pickup over to the side of the dusty Midwestern road. She wasn't expecting to find anyone out here. This back route was usually silent, except for the whisper of wind through the stalks. Yet there he was, a man slumped against a weathered fence post, his once-tailored suit shredded and coated with road dust, shoes scuffed like he'd been walking for miles. His face was gaunt, eyes hollow, but there was something defiant flickering in the ruins of his expression. For a moment, she thought he might be dead. The memory of Michael, her late husband, flashed sharp and painful. The night the sirens came, the unanswered prayers. She forced the memory down, stepped closer. "Sir, are you hurt?" Her voice was steady, though her heart rattled like the loose tailgate of her truck. He blinked, slow, like her words had traveled through water. "Guess that depends on what you call hurt," he rasped. Up close, Hannah caught the faint scent of whiskey and rain-soaked asphalt. His hair was streaked with gray at the temples, not old but worn. He told her his name was Richard Miller, though people used to call him Rick. Used to. Once he'd had an office with a skyline view in Chicago, a corner desk of glass and chrome. Once he'd fired 100 employees with a shrug. Once he'd been feared. Now he was the man who couldn't meet her eyes, gripping the fence as if it were the last thing tethering him to the earth. Something in Hannah softened and tensed all at once. She had two little girls waiting at home. A mortgage one late payment away from foreclosure, and a heart stitched together with grief. Bringing a strange man home was madness. But walking away while he looked at her with those haunted eyes felt worse. There was an unspoken plea in them, one she recognized because she'd seen it in her bathroom mirror at 3 a.m. The quiet question of whether a person's life still mattered. That night, over cornbread and beans in her cramped kitchen, Rick sat at her table like he didn't belong there, which he didn't. The girls, Emily and Grace, whispered and giggled, curious but unafraid. Under the yellow glow of the overhead bulb, he confessed pieces of his downfall. The reckless deals, the imploding company, the family who'd shut their doors on him. He didn't mention the bridge or the nights he stood staring down into the dark river, but Hannah sensed it anyway in the way his hands trembled over the chipped mug. Days bled into nights. He slept on her couch, fixed the squeaky porch step, and taught Emily fractions better than her teacher ever could. Grace started leaving her battered teddy bear by his pillow. Hannah found herself smiling more than she had in years, even as she scolded herself for it. Somewhere between laundry loads and late-night talks over weak coffee, Rick's walls cracked. He admitted what he'd done to people, how one of the men he'd fired, Charles Foster, had begged to keep his job because his wife was ill. Rick had walked away. Weeks later, she died. Rick had never forgiven himself. "People like me don't change," he said one night. "We just rot slower." "Or you learn," Hannah replied, her voice gentle but firm. "The question is, what will you do with the time you have left?" He didn't answer, but the next morning she found him drawing up a plan to expand her laundry service, scribbles of pricing tiers and flyers scrawled on scrap paper. A disgraced CEO offering his last currency, knowledge. Then, one cold Saturday, as the girls played in the yard and the scent of fresh bread filled the house, a knock rattled the door. On the porch stood a man in a worn blazer, his posture taut with contained fury. Hannah's stomach dropped when Rick froze mid-step, color draining from his face. "Rick Miller?" the stranger asked. Rick nodded, throat tight. "My name's Charles Foster," the man said evenly. "You probably don't remember me, but I remember you. I remember the day you fired me like I was trash. I buried my wife a month later." The silence that followed was a live wire. Hannah's girls peered around her legs. Rick's lips parted, but no sound came. What Charles said next, no one expected. I came here to tell you I carried that hate for years, and I'm done letting you live in my head. His voice broke. You ruined me, Rick, but I'm not here to ruin you. I'm here to see if the man who destroyed my life has the guts to become someone else. Hannah reached for Rick's hand under the doorway. He gripped back like a drowning man finding a rope. Something shifted in his eyes. Not absolution, but the first fragile step toward it. Do you believe a person who's caused irreparable harm can ever truly change? Would you have opened your door to Rick that night, knowing the darkness he carried? And as Charles waits for Rick's answer, none of them can imagine the other secret visitor already on the way, the one who could shatter everything they've built. Rick stood frozen in the doorway, Charles's words hanging heavy in the winter air. He felt as if the past had crawled out of his nightmares and planted itself on Hannah's porch. His pulse thudded in his ears, his mind a storm of shame and the faintest flicker of hope. Charles wasn't yelling, wasn't demanding vengeance. He was offering something far more terrifying, an opening for redemption. Before Rick could respond, the sound of tires crunching over gravel cut through the tension. A late-model SUV rolled up the driveway, too new, too out of place among the weathered fences and corn stubble. Hannah's stomach tightened. She didn't recognize the vehicle, but Rick did. His chest constricted as the driver stepped out, a tall teenage boy with his jaw set like stone, followed by a younger girl clutching a phone as if it were armor. They were older than when he last saw them, but there was no mistaking their faces. His children. His knees nearly buckled. "Dad?" the boy said flatly. It wasn't a greeting. It was an accusation wrapped in a single syllable. Grace and Emily glanced between the newcomers and Rick with wide-eyed confusion. Hannah sensed the storm gathering and instinctively guided her girls back inside, leaving the door ajar. Charles remained arms crossed, a silent witness to the reckoning. "Why are you here?" Rick's voice cracked. The boy's eyes burned. "We found your letter. Mom didn't want us to come, but I had to see if the stories were true, that you're living out here playing house with some other family while you abandoned us." Each word was a knife, and Rick had no defense. He had left, yes, but not the way they thought. He'd spiraled after the bankruptcy, convinced he was poison, that staying would wreck them even more. But how could he explain that to a son who watched his mother cry herself to sleep? Hannah stepped into the doorway, her face pale. This was the secret Rick had never fully shared, how completely he'd failed his first family. Now the worlds he tried to keep separate were colliding. Charles shifted uncomfortably, the anger in the boy's voice stirring his own buried grief. "Kid," Charles began quietly, "sometimes parents make mistakes so big they don't know how to crawl back." The boy shot him a glare. "And that makes it okay?" His voice cracked for the first time. The girl beside him, 13 maybe, finally spoke, her tone softer but trembling. "We just want to know why we weren't enough for you to fight for." Rick's breath caught. There it was, the question that haunted him every night. He stepped down the porch, the cold biting through his worn shoes. "You were always enough," he said, voice raw. "I wasn't. I was a coward who thought walking away would spare you my failures, but I see now it only hurt you more." The boy's chin trembled, but his glare didn't waver. "So what now? You just get a do-over with them?" He jerked his head toward the window where Emily and Grace watched with worried faces. Hannah's heart ached at the cruel symmetry of it all. Two sets of children, both longing for the same man to be someone they could trust. A silent stretch, taut and breathless. Then Charles, of all people, broke it. "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting, kid. It's about deciding not to let the worst thing someone did define every moment after." His own voice shook as if he were speaking to himself as much as to them. The boy's hard gaze flickered, uncertainty creeping in. Rick reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded photograph, edges worn from too many nights in his hands. It was the three of them from years ago, at a Cubs game, smiling before everything fell apart. He held it out, arm trembling. "I can't erase what I did. I can only ask for a chance to prove I can be better for all of you. But if you walk away now, I'll understand." The boy didn't take the photo. His sister did. She looked at it, then at Rick, tears glistening. The SUV idled, exhaust curling in the cold air like a ghost of everything left unsaid. If you were in the children's place, would you let Rick back into your life or walk away to protect yourself from more pain? And as the boy finally opened his mouth to answer, none of them saw the figure emerging from the SUV's back seat, a figure whose presence could unravel every fragile thread of peace they'd begun to weave. The SUV door clicked open again, and the air seemed to thicken. Rick's breath stalled when a familiar figure stepped out, bundled in a dark coat, her posture rigid. It was Claire, his ex-wife. She looked older than the woman he'd left behind, lines etched around her mouth, her eyes rimmed red, but her presence carried a storm of contained fury. For a moment, no one spoke. The wind hissed through the cornfields as Claire's gaze moved from Rick to Hannah's porch, to Charles lingering awkwardly. "So it's true," she said finally, her voice low and cutting. "You've built yourself a brand new family while your own kids wondered if their father was even alive." Her words landed like blows, and Rick flinched but didn't look away. "Claire, it's not what you think," he began, but she raised a hand to silence him. "You always had excuses, deals, deadlines, and when it all fell apart, you didn't just lose your company. You ran. You left me to pick up the pieces with two terrified kids asking why their dad didn't love them enough to stay." Behind her, the boy's jaw clenched. The girl hugged the photo tighter. Hannah stepped onto the porch, torn between defending Rick and respecting the raw history crashing into her yard. Rick felt the weight of two worlds colliding, his old life and the fragile peace he'd found with Hannah and her girls. He'd imagined this confrontation countless times, but never like this, never with Claire's eyes boring into him with that mixture of pain and accusation. "You're right," he said quietly, his voice cracking. "I failed you all. I thought leaving was mercy, but it was cowardice. I don't have an excuse, only regret." For a moment, something flickered in Claire's eyes, surprise maybe, but the fury returned quickly. Regret doesn't raise children. Regret doesn't pay bills. And regret doesn't erase the nights they cried themselves to sleep. Charles shifted, visibly uncomfortable, witnessing a scene so personal yet achingly familiar. He too knew what abandonment cost. Hannah felt her chest ache. She'd lost Michael, but she'd never had to answer for someone choosing to leave. "Claire," Hannah said gently, "I don't know your pain, but I've seen him trying. He's not the same man." Claire's sharp glance cut to her. "And that's supposed to make up for the years he vanished? That he's playing hero now in someone else's house?" The boy stepped forward suddenly, his voice breaking through the cold. "Mom, stop. I came here to see him, not to watch you destroy each other." His face was flushed, torn between anger and hope. "I don't know if I can forgive you," he said to Rick, voice trembling, "but I want to know if you're going to run again when it gets hard." The question stabbed deeper than any insult. Rick's mind screamed with guilt. Running was all he'd ever done. Could he stay this time when everything felt like quicksand? His heart thundered with the truth he owed them all. "No," he said, voice hoarse but steady. "I don't want to run anymore. Not from you, not from my mistakes. But I'll need time to prove it." Claire folded her arms, skeptical, but the boy's gaze softened a fraction. Then Claire's voice sliced the fragile moment. "Prove it? You don't have time. I'm filing to terminate your parental rights. The papers are in my bag. I came to give you the courtesy of knowing before you're served." Gasps broke the winter air. Rick felt the ground sway. Hannah gripped the porch railing. Claire's eyes glistened, though her face stayed hard. "They deserve stability. If you want to play house here, fine. But don't dangle hope in front of our kids just to vanish again." Rick's chest constricted. This was the reckoning he feared most. The boy looked shocked. The girl's tears spilled freely. A moral war raged inside Rick. Should he fight for his children's place in his life? Or step aside, believing they might be better without him? And what would Hannah think of the man she'd let into her home if he didn't fight at all? Do you think Claire is right to cut Rick out completely, or should he be given the chance to prove he's changed despite his past failures? As Rick opened his mouth to respond, a sudden cry from inside the house sent everyone running toward the porch, and what they found inside threatened to change everything once again. They rushed inside to find Grace crouched on the kitchen floor, her small frame shaking, her face pale. Emily knelt beside her sister, panic in her eyes. "She just collapsed," Emily cried. Hannah dropped to her knees, checking Grace's pulse with trembling hands while Rick stood frozen, terror flooding him. Claire hovered at the doorway, clutching her own children close as if shielding them from the chaos. "She's burning up," Hannah whispered, feeling Grace's forehead slick with sweat. "She was fine an hour ago," Rick stammered, his voice cracking under the weight of helplessness. "What's happening?" Grace stirred, mumbling words that barely made sense, and her breath came in shallow gasps. Hannah's heart pounded as she fought her own fear. She had seen fevers before, but something about the limpness of her youngest's body sent dread slicing through her. Rick scooped Grace into his arms without thinking, her tiny head against his shoulder. "We need a hospital, now." Claire's kids stood by, stunned, as Hannah grabbed her keys. The SUV that had brought Rick's past crashing back now became their lifeline. Minutes later, they were speeding down the cracked county roads toward the nearest ER, Hannah white-knuckled at the wheel. Rick in the back seat whispering to Grace, begging her to hold on. In that tight, desperate space, the earlier fight dissolved into something more primal, fear of losing a child. Claire sat stiff in the passenger seat, stealing glances back at Rick as his tears soaked Grace's hair. When they burst through the hospital doors, the staff whisked Grace away, leaving the adults in a waiting room thick with antiseptic and unspoken truths. Rick sank into a plastic chair, hands over his face. He'd only been part of Hannah's family for months, but the thought of Grace slipping away gutted him more than any corporate collapse or public disgrace ever had. He felt Claire's gaze on him and braced for another verbal blow, but instead her voice was quieter. "You love them," she said, almost disbelieving. Rick lifted his head, eyes raw. "I love all my children. That's the worst of it. I always did, even when I ran." His son looked at him, conflicted. The weight of every abandonment, every apology unsaid pressed down on Rick. If anything happens to her," Rick whispered, "I don't know how any of us survive it." Hannah returned from the hallway, face streaked with tears but voice steady. "She's stable for now. Severe infection. They're starting treatment, but we caught it just in time." Relief crashed over him so hard his body shook. But the reprieve carried a sharper edge. Life was reminding him how little control he had, how quickly everything could be lost. As the night stretched on in the humming fluorescent light, the conversation shifted. Claire admitted she'd rehearsed a speech full of rage and ultimatums on the way there, but watching Rick cradle Grace, she saw something she hadn't expected. A man undone by love rather than pride. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said, "but I see you trying. Maybe the kids need to see that too." Her words cracked something open in her son. He sat beside Rick, awkwardly at first, then asked if Grace would be okay. For Rick, it felt like the first bridge plank laid over an abyss. Still, the custody threat hung unspoken between him and Claire, the legal papers like a loaded gun in her bag. And Rick knew his biggest battle wasn't in a courtroom. It was convincing them all he wouldn't run again, no matter how scared he got. Outside, dawn bled pink over the horizon, but inside the waiting room, a different storm brewed. The doctor stepped back in with an odd expression, holding an envelope. "Mr. Miller," he said cautiously, "this was found in your daughter's belongings. We thought you should see it." Rick frowned, taking the envelope with shaking hands. His name was scrawled on the front in a child's handwriting, but not Grace's. He tore it open, and as he read the first line, his face drained of color. Whatever was inside had the power to rip open wounds none of them knew existed. What secret do you think was hidden in that letter? And how will it change the fragile trust forming between Rick's two families? As Rick looked up from the page, his lips parted in shock, and everyone braced for the revelation that could alter all their lives forever. Rick's hands trembled as he unfolded the letter, the childish scrawl making his heart pound. Everyone watched in tense silence as his eyes scanned the lines. The words were simple, almost painfully so, but they struck him harder than any of Claire's accusations. "Dear Mr. Rick," it began, "I know you're not really my dad, but I wish you were. Mom cries when she thinks we don't see. Emily says she remembers Dad's voice, but I don't. I wish I did. Sometimes I dream there's someone who wants us, even if we're not his real kids. Please don't leave like Michael. Love, Grace." The paper blurred as Rick's vision filled with tears. The letter wasn't new. Its creases were worn, edges soft from being hidden and unfolded countless times. Grace had carried this hope like a secret talisman, never daring to say it aloud. It was a love letter and a plea all at once, and it exposed the rawest truth. He had already become someone's father again, without even realizing it. The room was so quiet, Rick could hear his own shaky breath. Hannah covered her mouth, tears streaming. She hadn't known about the letter either. Claire's eyes softened against her will, seeing the messy ink and the sincerity of a child longing for stability. Rick's son shifted uncomfortably, something flickering across his face. Recognition, perhaps, that Grace's yearning wasn't so different from his own. Rick felt a terrible, beautiful ache. He wanted to promise everything to all of them, to never leave, to fight whatever battles came. But a darker voice whispered inside him. Could he keep that promise? He had failed before when life grew unbearable. What made him think he wouldn't fail again? His own children were watching him now, measuring his worth not by money or success but by courage and presence. The stakes were no longer financial or even legal. They were about hearts that had already been broken too many times. He looked up from the letter, voice raw. She wrote this not knowing if I'd stay, and she's right. I'm not her dad, but I want to be. I want to be there for all of you. I don't know how I'll make it right, but I can't run anymore. His son's face twisted with emotion, torn between anger and yearning. Words are easy, he said, voice tight. We've heard apologies before. Claire put a hand on her son's shoulder, but kept her eyes on Rick. If you mean it, you'll have to prove it every day. To them, to us, and to yourself. Before Rick could answer, the doctor reappeared, his expression now more serious. Grace's condition is stable, but there's something else, he said carefully. Her blood work shows she's been hiding symptoms for a while. Fatigue, dizziness. This infection revealed an underlying issue. She'll need ongoing treatment. The words landed like thunder. Hannah's knees nearly gave out. Rick steadied her, his own heart cracking. Grace had carried more than emotional burdens. Her little body had been fighting quietly too. The room tilted with a new, sharper fear. It wasn't enough to love them. Love would now demand sacrifice, resilience, and facing impossible choices. Rick felt the weight of every eye on him, waiting to see if he would break or rise. He folded the letter carefully, slipping it into his chest pocket like armor. He didn't have all the answers, but one truth crystallized. Leaving was no longer an option. Staying meant pain, responsibility, and maybe failure, but it was the only road forward. If you were Rick, how would you find the strength to stay and fight for both families when the weight of past failures and new fears feels unbearable? As the doctor's words sank in, another voice cut through the sterile quiet, this time from the hallway, carrying news that would test Rick's resolve even further. And none of them were prepared for what they were about to hear next. The voice from the hallway belonged to a nurse, breathless, carrying an urgent expression. "We need Hannah," she said. "Grace is asking for you." Hannah rushed toward the room, Rick and the others following. They found Grace propped up against white pillows, tiny and pale but awake, eyes shining weakly. A tangle of IV lines snaked from her arm, monitors beeping steadily. She smiled when she saw them, the kind of smile that holds more strength than any adult's. "Did you read it?" she asked Rick in a whisper. He knelt beside her bed, nodding, the letter still folded close to his heart. "I did, sweetheart, and I'm not going anywhere." Grace's eyelids fluttered. A tear slid down her cheek. "Good, because Mom smiles more when you're here." The simple truth in her words silenced the room. Claire turned away, blinking back tears. Rick's children stared at Grace as though seeing her for the first time not as a stranger, but as another kid longing for the same thing they once did. The days that followed blurred into a pattern of hospital corridors, whispered prayers, and restless nights. Grace's condition slowly improved under treatment, though the diagnosis meant there would be battles ahead. Rick stayed through every needle, every fever spike, holding her hand. He also sat with his own son and daughter in the cafeteria, awkward conversations blossoming into something resembling hope. Claire didn't hand over the legal papers. She tucked them away, though she reminded Rick she would watch his actions, not his apologies. "You show up," she said one evening, "and maybe they'll believe in you again. Maybe I will too." Weeks later, Grace returned home, thinner but grinning when Emily pushed her in a borrowed wheelchair. The farmhouse smelled of fresh bread again. Laughter returned, fragile but real. Rick moved into the small guest room, helping with laundry routes in the morning and homework at night. He made mistakes, lost his temper at himself more than anyone, but he stayed. Some evenings, under the wide Midwestern sky, he would sit on the porch with Hannah, the silence between them tender. "I used to think success was how high I could climb," he told her one night. "Now I think it's just being here, not running." She reached for his hand. Staying is harder than running. That's why it matters more. Spring brought a miracle Rick hadn't dared hope for. Claire drove the kids down one weekend. They stayed in the same house as Hannah's girls for the first time. There were awkward moments, slammed doors, and tears. But there was also the sound of all four children laughing in the yard, playing tag under the blooming dogwoods. Rick stood at the window watching them, a knot in his throat. He knew he couldn't undo the years he'd missed, but he could honor them by being present now. The past no longer defined him, his actions did. One quiet evening, as fireflies danced in the tall grass, Grace pulled something from her pocket and handed it to Rick. It was her letter, worn even more from being carried close. "You can keep it now," she said. "I don't need to hide it anymore." He hugged her carefully, overwhelmed by the gift of trust. His son watched from the porch steps, then walked over and joined the hug without a word. In that moment, Rick understood that redemption wasn't about erasing pain. It was about holding on to love despite it. Months later, there were still hospital visits, hard talks with Claire, and bills that made Hannah's brow furrow. But there was also Sunday dinners with everyone at the same table, laughter rising like a hymn, and the knowledge that broken things could be mended in ways more beautiful than anyone expected. Rick never reclaimed his old wealth or status. Instead, he gained something rarer, the respect of the people who mattered and the courage to keep choosing them every day. Under the stars one night, Hannah leaned against him and whispered, "Michael would be glad you stopped on that road." Rick looked up at the vast, starlit sky, the same one Michael once used to remind her how small problems were compared to the universe. Except now those stars seemed to celebrate the weight of love that bound them all together. The man who once stood on a bridge wondering if his life had any value now stood among his two families, imperfect but present, and for the first time, he knew he was exactly where he belonged. How did this story make you feel, and what part of it stayed with you the most? Comment 100 if you love this story. Which country are you watching from? Share this video with your friends to spread hope, and thank you for watching Hope Stories.